What's going on, guys? This upcoming weekend is the North American World Championship Qualifier, or NAWCQ as it's known, and at this event there is going to be a hat format side event for the Attack of the Giant card. And I know a lot of people are very excited for that event, a lot of players which haven't played hat format in a very long time, and some of which are even new to the format. So as a result, I wanted to make a video to go over some of the common ruling questions that I've been asked, as well as some of the common mistakes in rulings that I see from reacting to so much hat format replays and things of those sorts, as well as go over some of the parts of effects that are commonly forgotten or looked past that are very important, and even give a couple helpful tips and reminders when playing in hat format. Now, with all this being said, I am no judge or anything like that, so if I use the wrong terminology, I do apologize, but the information conveyed should be correct. And also, one thing to note is rulings are very different in this format compared to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In a lot of different cases. So with that being said, just make sure that you confirm, maybe even with a head judge ahead of time, in case there is a problem with that, or in general, there are differences in rulings from North America and Europe and stuff. So if a judge hasn't really played in a while, or, is a newer judge since hat format, always make sure that you have the right rulings ahead of time so that there isn't any sort of, misconception or anything there. In terms of the rulings I'm going to be telling in this video, they are the ones that are followed by North America. And if you play in a lot of online hat format tournaments or anything, these are going to be the rulings and things that are played in those events as well. And this is just a way, some of these are pretty common rulings, some should be pretty obvious, some might not be. And so if anything, this is just a refresher to the players that already are playing hat format and have been playing for a while this is going to hopefully be helpful to the players that are newer to the format so they don't get cheated or anything like that at this event. But with that being said, let's get straight into this video. All right, so the first cards I want to talk about are going to be the artifact cards, which, so many decks play and are one of the mainstays and main focus of hat format in general. We all know that these monsters can be set in the spell and trap card zone, and that they have the ability to special summon themselves when destroyed on the opponent's turn, and when they are destroyed and summoned that way on the opponent's turn, they will trigger in effect. But a common thing that a lot of people forget is when these are destroyed on the opponent's turn, it is mandatory to special summon them. So if we go over here, it says that right here, during your opponent's turn, if this set card in the spell and trap card zone is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, special summon it. It's not a you can effect. And same with Beagle Tech here. Same thing that, if it's destroyed and sent to the graveyard, special summon it. And same with Scythe. These are all mandatory. So the reason this comes up is you will see a lot of times where, one of these will be set and your opponent will have, say max seed you or something like that. And as a result, like for example, say maybe your opponent was summoning a monster, and then you activate a copy of Sanctum or something to summon an artifact, and then, you, for example, I guess going for Beagle Tech, right? But say they had dropped Max C. A lot of times when Beagle Tech goes to pop one of your sets or something like that, if they pop an artifact, sometimes because your opponent dropped Max C, your opponent will, or you'll say something like, oh no, I'm not going to activate the artifact in graveyard. And as a result, a lot of people, again, misplay like that because these are mandatory, so you do have to special summon them if they are destroyed. So just keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind with that is the effects of Beagle Tech and Scythe are both mandatory when special summoned. So for example, Scythe here says, if this card is special summoned during your opponent's turn, your opponent cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck for the rest of this turn. That is an activated effect, and it is mandatory, meaning your opponent can use cards like Traptrix, Trap Hole Nightmare on this card, and again, it is mandatory. Same with Beagle Tech, and Beagle Tech is a very interesting one that a lot of people forget as well. And this one says that if this card is special summoned during the opponent's turn, destroy up to 2 set cards you control, minimally 1. So popping your set cards is mandatory, and the part of this that is also easy to forget is it says set cards, meaning that if you have a back row and you have a set monster, you do have to pop the set monster. This doesn't refer to just spell or traps, and the other thing with this is this part of the effect does not target. So, a lot of people will make the mistake of saying Beagle Tech and say, like, target one of their sets. So, for example, if this Moral Tech was set, they would go, effect a Beagle Tech, target this. Don't do that, because sometimes if your opponent has an MST or something, they know now not to pop this set, because again, this does not target or anything like that. So just keep that in mind for that. The one thing that is different about Moral Tech is its effect when special summoned on the opponent's turn is optional. So you don't have to trigger its effect to destroy a face-up card. Obviously, this one's saying if this card is special summoned during your opponent's turn, you can destroy one face-up card your opponent controls. And with that, the thing with Moral Tech is it does not target. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an opponent go to activate the Moral Tech, and they will choose their target, and then the opponent will chain something as a result of what they're targeting. So make sure you remember that Moral Tech does not target. Next up, we have Sanctum. A common thing that people forget with Sanctum is a couple different things, actually. The main thing is going to be this last line, kind of, that says you can only activate one artifact Sanctum per turn, and then also you cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. So the thing with Sanctum is you can activate Sanctum on your own turn, but if you do, you cannot conduct your battle phase. And the other thing is obviously the artifact effects. For example, the Moral Attack Pop or the Beagle Attack Pop your sets, or the Scythe Lockout the opponent does not activate. Those only activate on the opponent's turn. So just keep in mind, if you really need to, you can activate this on your turn. And the part with you can only activate one Sanctum per turn, you can use both effects of Sanctum in a turn. Meaning, for example, usually this is going to be used on your opponent's turn. So say your opponent activates a MST and goes to hit this pop or the set Sanctum, you can go and activate Sanctum, chain and summon, say, a Moral Attack or something like that, and then the MST will destroy this, and on a separate chain, you can activate your Moral Attack if you want to, and the Sanctum effect to pop a card on the field will also be able to trigger. Now, you wouldn't be able to activate, say, 2 Sanctums, for example, but you can activate both effects. The other thing that, as you might have caught onto with that, is this card says that, you know, if this card in its owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, you can target a card on the field and destroy it. A lot of people forget that Sanctum can pop your own cards. So if you had another set artifact, you could actually use the Sanctum to pop that artifact, so then you're able to trigger it, whereas a lot of people tend to forget that and only pop the opponent's cards. Now, Ignition is one of the cards that I feel people get confused on the most with. Obviously, it says if you have an artifact monster in your deck, you can target a spell or trap card on the field, destroy that target, and if you do, set an artifact monster from your deck to your spell and trap card zone. And then if this card in the owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, your opponent skips their next battle phase. So this card trips people up in a lot of different reasons. So the first thing is being able to activate Ignition. A very common situation is if you, say, have 4 set cards and an Ignition in hand, or even if the Ignition is on the field set, for example. Now, when can you actually go and activate this Ignition? So if you have 4 other set cards, if you go to activate Ignition, again, whether it's set or in hand, you are able to activate the Ignition, but you're only able to pop your own spell and traps. So if your opponent has spell and traps, you would not be able to pop theirs in this exact situation. But again, you can pop your own. Now, with that, let me just return this to hand. Say you had 2 cards in hand, for example, these. At that point, you would be able to activate Ignition and pop your opponents, but again, if you have 4, you can only pop your own cards. So that is something very important that a lot of people tend to forget. Now, I know on this version it says if you have an artifact in deck, but a lot of the copies in person do not say that, so just keep in mind you can only activate Ignition if you do have a valid target in deck as well. Now, another interaction that comes up a lot post-side in a lot of matches is going to be with Dimensional Fissure and Macro Cosmos versus the artifacts. So the thing is, for example, let me just put this face down. If Dimensional Fissure is on your opponent's side of the field, or your side for that matter, and a set artifact is destroyed, these are destroyed as spell and trap cards, and as a result, they will go to graveyard and not be banished off of Dimensional Fissure, meaning you're still able to then trigger the artifacts and bring them back. Now, where it's a little different is if Macro Cosmos is face up on the field and an artifact is destroyed, it will get banished because Macro specifically says that any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. It doesn't say spell or trap or monster, it's just any card, whereas Dimensional Fissure specifically says any monster sent to the graveyard is banished. Another very common situation is going to be Artifact Ignition versus Soul Charge. So Soul Charge says you cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card, as well as Ignition, again, has that ability that says that if this card in the owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, your opponent skips their next battle phase. So how this is going to work is the wording is slightly different on these ones. So, for example, if your opponent activates Soul Charge, and then if you were to, say, have them MST your set Ignition or something along those lines, obviously your opponent cannot conduct their battle phase, meaning Ignition's effect that skips their next battle phase will apply to the following turn. So this is sort of like a modern, or like a kind of old school version of a runic spell, where your opponent has to specifically go and declare that they are skipping their battle phase. Online tournaments have kind of gone with the same thing that runics have, where it's sort of implied, but you do want to make sure that this is going to apply, and it goes until your opponent declares that they are actually skipping that. And this will continue on, for example, with the Soul Charge. Soul Charge is just your one. You don't have to say you're declaring or anything like that, but do keep in mind, for example, with something like these types of cards like Ignition, how you can't conduct your battle phase, meaning if you're in main phase 1 and you go to resolve Ignition, it goes straight to end phase. It's kind of like how runic cards are as well. So that is an interaction where you do want to keep in mind if your opponent soul charged as well as, you know, destroyed your Ignition. A lot of people even sometimes forget that Ignition skips the next battle phase because some turns can be super interactive, but that's definitely something you do not want to forget. Next up are the Traptrix monsters, and there's not a whole lot to say with these, but one thing that I find it funny I even have to say this is the first line of text on these two cards people tend to forget, and that is simply that they are unaffected by the effects of whole normal traps. And so something that I don't know why, even myself playing online, I've seen people do this, where I will like normal summon Mermail or say Call the Haunted a Mermail or something along those lines, and my opponent will activate a bottomless, and I'm just like, okay, cool, like that's fine, it resolves and does nothing. So just remember that these are unaffected by these whole normal trap cards here, because again, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people forget this. Another thing to keep in mind is Mermail's secondary effect. If it's special summoned, you target a spell or trap your opponent controls and destroy that target. That effect is mandatory, so if it is summoned off of Call the Haunted, Soul Charge, or anything like that, you do have to activate this. It's not an option, whereas Diana's secondary effect that says when this card is special summoned, you can target one whole normal trap in your graveyard, set that target, but banish it during the end phase of your next turn if it's still on the field. That is optional. Obviously, there is a you can versus this one. It just says target one spell or trap your opponent controls and destroy it. So do keep that in mind, and also do remember that the Diana is going to banish whatever card you reset during your next end phase if it's still on the field. So if you do activate it, it will go to graveyard as normal. Next up, we have the hands, Fire and Ice Hand, and these tend to be very confusing for a lot of players simply because they can miss timing. And now what does that mean? It means if they are destroyed as Chainlink 2 or higher, they will not trigger. So a common example of that is going to be, say you summon a Fire Hand, your opponent activates a card like Artifact Ignition or MST, and then after that, they chain a copy of Torrential Tribute. Torrential Tribute will destroy the hand, and then the last thing to happen is not the destruction of the hand, but rather the MST or Ignition trying to resolve. So in that case, the hand will not be able to use its effect. If it was a Fire Hand, for example, it would not be able to destroy a monster and then summon a copy of Ice Hand from deck. With that being said, it doesn't mean that if a chain is occurring that a hand isn't going to activate because it's Chainlink 2. And now what exactly I mean by that specifically is, for example, if you have a Fire Hand and your opponent has a Fire Hand and they crash into each other, obviously turn player is going to be Chainlink 1 and the opponent is going to be Chainlink 2. Because both hands were destroyed at the same time, that is not being like a technical Chainlink 2, you're just forming a chain, and as a result, both players will be able to activate their Fire Hands, both of them, being able to pop a monster and then summon a Ice Hand. It's simply because you're forming a chain again, and you're not necessarily being destroyed as Chainlink 2. So another common example to kind of help you understand them missing timing is, say you have a Fire Hand on board and your opponent summons something like a Artifact Moraltac. Moraltac triggers to pop your Fire Hand, and say your opponent also had like a set monster, which we'll just say is going to be this Ice Hand, for example. So if that were to occur and the Fire Hand gets destroyed, Fire Hand would trigger, and say you pop the set Ice Hand and then summon your own copy of Ice Hand, the opponent's Ice Hand would not be able to trigger because it was destroyed during the chain, and the last thing to happen is the Ice Hand that you summoned from deck, and not the destruction of the opponent's Ice Hand. Another common thing to keep in mind is the hands say that when they are destroyed in your possession and sent to the graveyard. So what that means is if your opponent summons a Fire Hand and you bottomless it, it will not be able to trigger its effect to float and destroy and things of those sorts. But if your opponent, say, summons a Fire Hand and you activate Solemn Warning, then they will be able to trigger the effect because it is destroyed in your possession and it does go to graveyard. So if you do have Solemn Warning, I would suggest holding that until the Fire Hand is destroyed and attempting to use its effect. And with that being said, even if your opponent's not choosing to use the summon effect, maybe, for example, they just aren't wanting to, maybe they're under max C or something, but they are choosing to use the destroy effect, you can still Solemn Warning that because it's all part of the same effect, just both parts of the effect are optional. So what I mean by that is, obviously it says when this card in your possession is destroyed by opponent's card and sent to your graveyard, you can target a monster they control and destroy it, and then after that you can special summon a Ice Hand from deck in the case of Fire Hand. I guess I should mention as well, for both of these to trigger their effects, the first part of the effect needs to actually occur. So for example, if your opponent has a 101 with a material on the field and they run over your Fire Hand can trigger to attempt to destroy the 101, but if the 101 protects itself, then the Fire Hand did not destroy a monster your opponent controls, and as a result, they will not be able to float. Also, say for example, your opponent has no back row and they run over an Ice Hand, the Ice Hand isn't able to destroy an opponent's spell or trap, and as a result, the Ice Hand will not be able to summon a Fire Hand from deck. Another niche situation is going to be with Vanity's Emptiness face up and a hand. So for example, say your opponent has a Vanity's Emptiness on their board. I'll actually just move it over here to hopefully make it a little bit easier. And so how this is going to work, oh, I can't move it again, I guess. If, for example, they have a monster on board and I were to attack Fire Hand into their monster, say even a 101 with no materials, so it's not able to protect itself, I can crash the Fire Hand into the 101 and trigger the Fire Hand to pop the 101. But as a result, I would not be able to summon an Ice Hand from deck because Vanity's Emptiness having the effect that if a card is sent from your deck or field to your graveyard, destroy this card, this would activate on a separate chain to destroy itself, and as a result, it's still on the field when the Fire Hand is trying to resolve. That being said, if I had an Ice Hand and was attacking in, the Ice Hand would be able to trigger popping the Vanity's Emptiness, and then I would be able to summon a Fire Hand from deck as the Vanity's Emptiness would no longer be on the field. So next up, I want to talk about trigger locations. And so this is a little confusing for people that play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because obviously you can just kind of make your chains however you want, but similarly how I mentioned before about how your chains have to resolve and things of those sorts where, you know, you get your mandatory effects, then your opponent gets their mandatory effects, then you get your optional effects, then your opponent gets their optional effects. With all that being said, cards that meet their trigger locations first have to activate first before the ones that would happen afterwards. So the most common example is going to be with something, for example, like Mermail Abyss Teus and one of the Atlanteans. Most commonly, I guess we always are going to use Dragoons because it's one of the more common ones. So when you go and activate Teus, you're activating and discarding the Dragoons, and from there the Teus is then going to be summoned. So here the Teus is summoned and the Dragoons was sent to graveyard. As a result, the Dragoons has to be Chainlink 1 because it went to graveyard and met its requirement before the Teus. So it's always going to be Dragoons Chainlink 1, Teus Chainlink 2 to search. You cannot go Teus Chainlink 1, Dragoons Chainlink 2, and as a result, that means that something like Teus is going to be the last thing to happen on that chain, so it becomes very susceptible to things like Traptrix, Trap Hole, Nightmare, but that is something that you do need to keep in mind, that you're not able to chain block exactly in that case, again, because the trigger location and the effect for Dragoons met its requirement before the Teus met its requirement. Now, speaking of which, if Teus activates its effect and sends Dragoons, your opponent is able to chain DD Crow and banish the copy of Dragoons, and as a result, the Teus will be summoned and it will be able to trigger, but because the Dragoons is no longer in the location at the end of the chain where it would be able to activate, you would not be able to activate the Dragoons effect. Most commonly, this is used with something like Genex Undyne, where you would summon Genex Undyne, send for cost, and then if the opponent DD Crows whatever you sent for cost, then it will not be able to trigger if it's no longer in the graveyard in that exact case. Another thing to keep in mind with the Atlanteans exactly is their effects that activate when sent to the graveyard for a water monster's effect. These are mandatory effects. So for example, Dragoons, if this card is sent to the graveyard to activate a water monster's effect, add one Sea Serpent monster from your deck to your hand. Or Infantry, if this card is sent to the graveyard to activate a water monster's effect, target a face-up card your opponent controls, destroy that target. Or Marksman, doing the same thing but to a set card the opponent controls. These are all mandatory and they do need to activate. So in a lot of cases where they are sent for the effect of a, you know, Teus or Megalo or something like that, these in most cases are going to be a Chainlink 1 given, you know, you are turn player. But unlike the Atlanteans, a Mermail Abyss Gun is a optional effect. It says you can target a Mermail monster in your graveyard and special summon that target. So if you were to use Teus and discard Gund, you are able to choose your chain links because both are optional effects. So you are able to, you know, say you wanted to kind of chain block with Teus, then you're able to do that, you know, using the Gund, going Chainlink 1 Teus, Chainlink 2 Mermail Abyss Gund. Another key thing to keep in mind is say you activate Abyss Teus in hand, discarding a Dragoons, and your opponent goes Solemn Warning on the Teus, the Dragoons will still be able to trigger to add a Sea Serpent monster from deck to hand, despite the Teus's summon being negated, and that's simply just because it was still recognized as being sent for the effect of a water monster. Another common occurrence is going to be Marksman versus a opponent's set Ignition or set Sanctum. So say, for example, you summon a copy of Mermail Abyss Pike, discarding Marksman, and your opponent says it's good. You resolve the Pike, you get your search of a level 3 water monster, and then say the Marksman targets the set Ignition. So pretend this Ignition is set. If your opponent goes and chains the Ignition to pop one of your back row or one of their own back row, then the secondary effect of Ignition that says if this card in the owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, your opponent skips starts their next battle phase, that will not trigger, simply because Marksman specifically has to pop set cards, and now this is face up, so it's not being destroyed by the Marksman. And same with the Sanctum. If your opponent activates the Sanctum in response to Marksman targeting it, you will not, or they will not get the secondary effect to destroy a card on the field. A key thing to keep in mind with Abyss Sphere is specifically that Abyss Sphere summons the monster and it has its effects negated, but that doesn't mean that you can't attempt to activate the effect. So for example, say you activate Sphere and summon Pike, and you have an Atlantean or say a Gund or something in hand, you can still activate the effect discarding one of these cards, and obviously the Pike won't resolve, but you will still be able to trigger your Atlantean or, you know, your Mermail type effect, whatever was discarded off of this despite it being negated. Another thing with Sphere to remember is it destroys itself during your opponent's next end phase, so don't activate this during your opponent's end phase. Reason being is it says during your opponent's next end phase after activation, and that's why you always want to do this during your opponent's main phase 2, in most cases at least. So if they say ending turn, make sure to say, hey, in main phase 2, I'll be activating Sphere. If you're planning to, you know, go for a Lind, and then Lind will blow up when the Sphere blows up, and you'll get another Mermail summon. Just keep that in mind. And the other thing that a lot of people tend to forget with this card is it says that you cannot activate any spell cards, period. That's in its own thing. So if you activate Sphere, you are not able to activate spell cards while this is on the field. And the reason this matters is if you activate Sphere, for example, and then your opponent is going to trap stun it the turn that it is activated, then this card will not have its self-destructing effect, and as a result, your opponent will be locked out of spell cards, or I guess whoever activated the Sphere in that example would be locked out of spell cards on the following turns, simply because I believe it was ruled for NA that it's not maintenance costs to destroy this. Someone can correct me in the comment section, but in general, if, you know, trap stun is activated the turn that the Sphere is activated, then this will just stay on board, and so as a result, your opponent, or whoever activated this, won't be able to use the commonly played things like Upstart Goblin, Soul Charge, or anything like that, just again because it has that effect where you cannot activate any spell cards. Sort of on the topic of cards being in different locations, if Debunk is activated and the card was activated and in a different place at the time of it resolving, it will not get banished. So what I mean by that is, say, you know, I don't know, your opponent summons a monster and then you activate Effect Veiler, sending it to graveyard, and your opponent chains Debunk. The Debunk will still negate the activation of that card, but the Veiler will not get banished, and that can be somewhat relevant in a lot of cases. For example, if you have something like a Soul Charge and you were hoping to bring back the Veiler potentially to make some sort of play or something along those lines. So even with the Dragon Rulers, their first effect, for example, if I were to use Blaster, discarding it and a fire monster to destroy a card or whatever, if my opponent goes Debunk, the Blaster will not be banished, versus say my opponent goes and activates Abyss Teus, discards their whatever it is, and then I activate Debunk. In that case, the Teus is still in hand where it activated, and as a result, the Teus would be banished in that example. Next up, monsters that specifically negate effects that have to be activated directly to a specific card are able to be activated in damage step. So most commonly are going to be Skullmeister, Bujingi Turtle, and Photon Strike Bouncer that specifically activate when their requirement is met, pretty much. So for example, against a Fire Hand or something, if the opponent has a Fire Hand and crashes it into one of your monsters, and or say like into a Yamato or something like that, and they go to use the effect to pop the Yamato, you can use the Turtle, banishing it to protect from that. Or even then, Skullmeister, if a hand crashes into your monster and uses its effect, you can Skullmeister in the damage step. I know like modern copies, for example, like even on here, they have the updated text that says except during the damage step, but during hat format, again, any monster effect specifically that negates effect, not activation in this case, effect, and it has to be chained directly to the card that it is, you know, targeting or doing whatever it is, you are able to activate those. On the topic of Yamato and hand traps in general, during hat format, Effect Veiler, while the modern copies say until the end of this turn, Effect Veiler specifically during this time period said until the end phase. So if, you know, you had a Yamato and your opponent activates Veiler on it during the main phase or whatever, when you get to the end phase, again, going back to when effects can activate and stuff, you have to do mandatory effects first, which Veiler is mandatory to stop the negating. So in that exact example, you'd be able to pass priority to your opponent if you have no mandatory effects. Yamato is a optional effect. It says you can, and so you could pass the mandatory priority over to your opponent. They have to resolve this Veiler in theory, and then it's your chance to do optional effects, so you could activate the Yamato in that case. So despite it being Veilered during the main phase, once you get to the end phase using priority, your Yamato would still be able to activate. Next up, something to keep in mind is Lonefire Blossom and Card D are two very common examples of cards that tribute for cost. So that means that if, say, Skill Drain is on the field, if you have a Card or a Lonefire, you can activate their effect tributing for cost and still, for example, in Lonefire, be able to summon a plant, or in Card's example, you'll still get to draw 2 and go to end phase, and that's partially because Skill Drain specifically says negate the effects of all face-up monsters while they're face-up on the field, so because these tribute for cost, you will still be able to activate them. Similarly, with Fiendish Chain, it negates the effects of that face-up monster while it's on the field. So, don't use your Fiendish Chains on Cars and Lonefires because they still will be able to trigger. Now, with Breakthrough Skill, it's a little bit different because as long as this resolves, it doesn't have to do specifically with on the field. So if your opponent, say, summons Lonefire Blossom and you Breakthrough Skill and it resolves, yes, they can activate it and tribute for cost, but it will resolve with no effect, so they will not get the summon. And same with Card D. If they summon Card D and you Breakthrough Skill it and they tribute it for cost, they will still not get the effect. So just keep in mind that Breakthrough Skill, yes, it will negate in that case, but under Fiendish Chain and Skill Drain, it will not. And similarly with Breakthrough Skill, Effect Veiler is the same way on something like a Lonefire Blossom, where if your opponent summons Lonefire and you activate Veiler, they can still tribute the Lonefire for cost, but it will not work in terms of summoning, and that's partially due to effects that have already resolved. So I guess another thing to bring up is with cards like Forbidden Lance, if, say, your opponent, I'll move this so you guys have a better understanding, if your opponent summons Lonefire and I activate Breakthrough Skill, then this will be negated, and that means later in the turn, say they had upstarted or something and drew a copy of Forbidden Lance, for example. So say now they have a Lance in hand, even if they go and activate this Lance after the breakthrough's already resolved, this will still be negated. So keep in mind, effects that have already resolved are not going to be affected by this Lance. So say the Skill Drain is on the board and my opponent goes and summons Pike. At any point in the turn, if they go and then activate a Lance, or I guess not at any point, but let's just say the Lance is here. So they normal summon Pike, then they activate Forbidden Lance while Skill Drain is on the board. This will be unaffected, so they will still go and be able to actually get the effect off of the Pike because it's no longer affected by the Skill Drain during this turn exactly. Another thing to keep in mind with Forbidden Lance and Fiendish Chain, or I guess Fiendish Chain in general, is if Fiendish Chain is on a monster and then at some point you Forbidden Lance it, it will become unaffected by this, but then when the next turn comes around, the Fiendish Chain will still be equipped with the Abyss Pike, so it won't be able to attack or anything like that. Now, that would be different if, say, the Lance was activated in response to the Fiendish Chain being activated. There's a whole bunch of cases with that, but just keep in mind, if this has already resolved and stuff and you activate the Lance and then the monster is still on the board, it will go back to being affected by it after the turn has ended. Now, still on the topic of monster effects being activated or anything like that under Skill Drain, if Skill Drain is active on the field, you cannot activate Breakthrough Skill, as this only has the effect to negate a face-up monster's effect, whereas Fiendish Chain would be able to be activated under Skill Drain because not only is this negating the monster's effect, but it's also making so that face-up monster cannot attack. So because this has more than just the effect negating, you are able to activate this. So if this were to be, say, the board state, if, let me just, I guess, set this here, say Skill Drain is on the board, I could not activate Breakthrough Skill, but if Skill Drain is on the board, I can activate Fiendish Chain, and this monster would not be able to declare an attack still. Also, keep in mind with Breakthrough Skill, I see this way too often, that people forget that Breakthrough Skill has its negating capabilities in Graveyard, but with that, there is something you need to keep in mind. You need to keep in mind that this says during your turn, specifically, so you cannot activate this on your opponent's turn in Graveyard, and also you cannot activate it the same turn it was sent to Graveyard. So a big thing that I'll see is in, for example, Lightsworn Ruler, they'll summon a Raiden, this will get sent, the opponent might activate a Sanctum or something, and then use the Moral Attack, and then they'll chain this right away. You cannot do that as it was sent during that turn, but say it was sent on a different turn, and then your opponent were to say activate Sanctum and summon a Moral Attack to try to pop your card, you are able to chain the Breakthrough and banish it to be able to negate that Moral Attack's effect in that example. But do keep in mind, again, it's only on your turn that you can do that and not on the turn it was sent to Graveyard. Another thing is with Trap Stun. Trap Stun says negate all other trap effects on the field this turn, so you would still be able to use the Breakthrough Skill Grave effect if Trap Stun is being applied. Next up is the field spells, and we all know in hat format there can only be one active field spell at a time, but with that, I think a lot of people forget what active field spell means. So for example, let's say I have Mount Sylvania on the field. If my opponent were to say, let me just try to get this, actually, let me just move this. So we'll have the opponent be on Mount Sylvania. So say this is on their side of the field, and I go and activate a copy of Necro Valley. This will be destroyed in that example. But what can happen is, let's now swap over. Let's say the opponent has Necro Valley and I have this copy of Mount Sylvania. I am able to set the Mount Sylvania and both are on the field, but as we see, only one is active, so this would be allowed. Now, say I were to then flip this face up, this would obviously destroy the copy of Necro Valley in that example. So keep in mind, just because your opponent sets a field spell, it does not mean your field spell will be destroyed. It's only when another would be activated that the other is destroyed. Speaking of field spells, a very common thing also to keep in mind is with Spellbook Grand Tower, or the Grand Spellbook Tower, something you need to keep in mind is this card can miss timing. So for example, say in the standby phase, you go to use this effect to put one of your Spellbook spells on the bottom of the deck and draw a card. When you go to activate this and your opponent activates a artifact ignition on this, you will not get the draw and you will also not get the special summon of a spellcaster because that will make it miss timing. And similarly, another quick Spellbook thing that I kind of forgot to throw in the deck itself is with cards like Spellbook of the Master. Master does target the Spellbook spell in graveyard. So if you activate that and your opponent activates Crow on the target for the Spellbook of the Master, then you will not apply its effects. So just keep that in mind as well. A couple quick things with Infernity is just remember that Infernity Barrier, for it to activate, obviously we know that the opponent has to have no cards in hand, but keep in mind for Barrier to activate, your opponent, or whoever has the Barrier, I guess I should say, needs to have an attack position Infernity monster. I've seen so many times where an opponent will have like a defense position Necromancer, for example, and they will go and activate the Barrier. Make sure that whoever's activating Barrier has an attack position Infernity monster, or even if you're trying to, out the opponent's Infernity board, and if your opponent maybe isn't thinking and you're able to out whatever Infernity's in attack position, that the Barrier will then be turned off. The other thing is with Infernity Break, a lot of people will think that this banishes for cost, and it does not. It says if you have no cards in your hand, target an Infernity card in your graveyard and one card your opponent controls, and that is the cost for the card, and then it says banish that first target, and if you do, destroy the second target. So what that means is, say we have this copy of Infernity Barrier in graveyard, and my opponent goes and activates the copy of Infernity Break, and they target this copy of Barrier and my monster, whatever. If I go and activate DD Crow, banishing the Infernity Barrier, then the Infernity Break will not be able to destroy my monster, as it says that you banish the first target, and if you do, destroy the second target. So because they did not do the first part of the effect, they will not get that secondary part of the effect. A couple quick Geargia things is remember that Geargiano MK2 for its effect does activate as well when it's flip summoned. A lot of people forget that it's not only when it's normal summoned. If it is flip summoned, then you're able to special summon a Geargia monster from your hand or graveyard in defense position. Also with that effect, obviously that does not target. So, in terms of targeting, a lot of people will, summon this, activate, and say target. Don't say your target, because if your opponent has a Crow or something, then they might chain it to it. And then, at that point, if you remember, oh yeah, it doesn't target, then they'll be like, oh, well, I don't want to use the Crow. And you don't want to get into that whole argument with your opponent over wording and stuff of those sorts. And with that being said, the effect of Geargia X, that when this face-up card leaves the field, you can target a level 3 or lower Geargia monster in your graveyard and special summon that target. Keep in mind that that part of the effect does target. I've had more people say target with MK2 than they have with Geargia. I've had people say that Geargia doesn't target, despite it obviously saying target. So do keep that in mind. And another thing is Geargia can miss timing as well, because it is a when can effect. So if, your opponent summons a Geargia X and you activate, or they activate the effect, and you go Traptrix, Trap Hole, Nightmare, the Geargia X will not be able to float into that level 3 or lower Geargia via that way. And as well, if your opponent summons Geargia X and you activate Blackhorn of Heaven, this technically never hit board yet, so it will not be able to float in that instance either. And I guess one other thing to note is Geargia Accelerator is an inherent special summon. You cannot summon it when Geargia X is on the board. If it's your only monster, you have to have another Geargia monster in order to special summon it, and Accelerator can miss timing as well. In terms of Blackhorn as well, keep in mind this stops inherent special summons, so things like Xyz summoning or, for example, Heretic Dragon of Tefnuit that special summons without starting a chain. So if your opponent activates something like a Artifact Sanctum or a Call the Haunted or something, you cannot activate the copy of Blackhorn, again, only on inherent special summons. One other thing to keep in mind is cards like Geargia X and Absolute Zero will get to trigger their secondary effect. So Geargia summoning that copy of a level 3 or lower Geargia monster, and Absolute Zero getting the effect that when it leaves the field to destroy all monsters your opponent controls if they are returned to the hand or extra specifically. I think there might be something in terms of wording when it comes to shuffled into the deck, but if they're specifically like compulsed, you will get to trigger their effects despite them kind of being hidden at that point. It's still considered to recognize that. Only a couple more things to go. Something I want to remind you guys is the effects of Gaios and Ophion are reciprocal, meaning, for example, Ophion making so that level 5 or higher monsters can't be special summoned, and Gaios saying that level 5 or higher monsters cannot attack applies to both players, and keep in mind it's while they have material. So if a Gaios or an Ophion has no material, then you are able to, for example, in Gaios' case, level 5 or higher monsters will be able to attack if it has no material, and with Ophion, if it has no material, level 5 or higher monsters will be able to be special summoned. Do keep that in mind, and with that Abyss Gaios, I can't tell you how many times I've seen an opponent have a Mooling Glacia or a Title on field and still go to attack, or even like a Leo or something. So keep in mind, if your opponent has a Gaios and a Leo and a Title on board, and the Gaios has material, they will not be able to go and declare an attack with those level 5 or higher monsters. Exciton is a once per chain. It even says right away once per chain during your main phase. So that is not a once per turn, or it's not, a once per turn effect. So if you activate this and it resolves and then, you meet the requirements again, you can activate this again in the same turn, just simply not in the same chain. So I guess, for example, you go to activate the Exciton, your opponent goes and activates Breakthrough. You can't chain this again in that exact example there. It's not like Zeus or anything like that, and people tend to forget that. So do definitely keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that this effect can activate during your opponent's battle phase, not their main phase. A lot of people will do that, as well as with cards like 101. People forget that 101 specifically has to take an opponent's special summoned attack position monster, not like if they have a monster in defense, you can't take it with a 101, and if they have a normal summon monster, you can't take it with a 101. So do keep those in mind, as well as those are things that people mess up quite a lot. Last thing I want to bring up is the sylvans. Sylvans specifically, for their excavating, in most cases, they'll have this line where it says once per turn, you can excavate the top card of your deck or some amount of cards from the top of your deck. And if it's a plant monster, send it to graveyard. And if you do, for example, this one will draw a card or some have other effects. The secondary part of it where it says otherwise place it on the bottom of the deck, most of them do have that, where remember that the other cards will go to the bottom or top or wherever the card mentions. Usually it's going to be the bottom, but Sylvan Princess Sprout is one of the few examples that just says you contribute this card, excavate the top card of your deck, and send it to graveyard. It doesn't have to be just a plant, so any card excavated off of Princess Sprout is going to go to graveyard. Again, most of these Sylvan monsters do just put non-plant cards that are excavated to the bottom of the deck. Anyways, guys, I know this was a very long video, and I probably missed a handful of stuff, and it was kind of all over the place, but hopefully you guys could get a good understanding of what I was going on with this. And again, there's so many other rulings and things that I could bring up, so just keep that in mind. This was just meant to be sort of a refresher and some of the more common things that do pop up in hat format. If you have questions about anything else, feel free to comment them in the comment section down below. If you want to see another version of this talking about more things like that, then definitely let me know as well. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, share this video with your friends, and good luck to everyone who is going to the NAWCQ, who is trying to play in that Attack of the Giant card. And anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.